welcome to the Red Teaming Adventures in Active Directory course. This originally was a webcast I gave back in February of 2019, but since then I re-recorded it so I could add extra slides that give examples of the commands I used during the demos. So what is this course about? Well, during a pen test, we're trying to get to our client-sensitive data. And to do that, you either need to compromise the IDs that have access to that data or the systems that hold the data. In most cases, all of those IDs and systems are stored within a company's Active Directory environment. So if you compromise AD, we then have unfettered access to the entire network. So I'm here to give pen testers and other security professionals a better understanding of what AD is and how to better attack and utilize it during a pen test. Overall, we're going to cover a variety of different topics. First, we're going to start off with a brief overview of what AD is and what its attack surface is. We're also going to cover how you can find the different domains that a client has on their network, how you can search those domains for the targets that you actually want to compromise, how you can gather clear text passwords or password hashes on a network, how you can abuse the different authentication security protocols used by AD, and how you can leverage trust to gain admin access to a remote domain. Finally, we're going to cover how you can grant yourself persistent access to AD itself. Overall, we're going to cover both attacks and then why they work. Before I get started with the content, I'll give a little bit of information about myself. My name is Eric Kuehn, and I'm a senior security consultant with Secure Ideas. I have close to 20 years experience with IT and IT security, most of that revolving around Windows systems architecture, and system security. Before I started with Secure Ideas, I was responsible for two very large AD infrastructures. One of them is probably one of the largest, if not the largest and most complex in the world, held by a financial institution based out of Charlotte. And before that, the AD infrastructure for a very well-known entertainment company based out of Orlando. Overall, I'm a movie enthusiast, love going to movies and watching them. I enjoy playing games, whether that's board games or computer games, and I'm the father of 4. At this point, my hobby really is taking my children to their hobbies, and I'm looking forward to the day when I can get started with mine again, and it's getting closer every day. And my email address is there at the bottom, eric@securideas.com if you have any questions. So let's get started by having a quick review of Active Directory. Everybody already knows that AD is the authentication and authorization hub for a Windows network. However, there are a large number of subcomponents all working together to give that experience. I'm not going to cover each one in detail, but I am going to give a high-level overview of the entire environment so you have a good idea of what the attack surface is and how these different things all function together. As we begin talking about the different Active Directory components, the first thing we have to know is that the server hosting all of these components is called the domain controller. Sometimes they're interchanged as people talk about them, but really, once again, they're two separate things. Active Directory is a service, and the domain controller is a server running that service. As we look through the different components, the first one is the LDAP server, and that's what we typically think of when we're talking about Active Directory. It's all of the users and computers and group membership, etc. within a Windows environment. However, one domain controller could have multiple LDAP partitions. The first is the domain partition, which is the full set of information of objects within a domain. But the next partition is called the Global Catalog partition, or GC partition. It contains a subset of information of all objects and all domains in a single forest. Now, a forest is a collection of domains that share a common schema. A schema is just a list of all of the different object types and attributes that can go to those objects. But it's also the security boundary in the Active Directory environment. Once you have access to one domain or an object to one domain in a forest, you have some level of access to all domains in that forest. It might only be read, but you could be granted other bits of access. And this is kind of important to understand that the forest is the security boundary and not the domain. People typically think it's the domain, but that's really just a replication boundary. And later on, we're going to show how we can exploit this to give admin access to a different domain within one forest. Now, there are some other partitions that could exist, namely the DNS partition. If a company is using Active Directory integrated DNS, there will be LDAP information for that zone as well. Now, you can't interact with it like you can the other partitions and read information out of it, but it still is there. And if you happen to be an administrator of the Active Directory environment, then you can start doing some other things with this partition as well. Now, not every company is using Active Directory integrated DNS because it's not a requirement. We do list the DNS server down there as a potential service, but it may not be on a domain controller. It is possible to use AD if you're using Bind or some other DNS system. It does not require AD integrated DNS. Now, as we talk about the partitions, it's very important to understand that you could get admin access to objects within a domain, right? However, that access does not directly correlate to access to servers, to admin access on servers, or any access to servers, really. Once you become an administrator to Active Directory, you can modify objects in AD. Now, you can make yourself a member of a group or something that gives you access to a server, but by default, you don't have direct access. However, you could also grant yourself admin access by using that configuration and policy enforcement portion of Active Directory. This is done through GPOs. Microsoft included the ability to push configuration management changes, whether that's how desktop looks or specific drive mappings, whatever you can really think of, to a Windows system down through Active Directory. Now, if a company has purchased third-party products, they could also extend this configuration enforcement to other device types, such as Linux servers or Macs or anything really. But once again, you may not have direct admin access, but you could use the GPOs to give yourself admin access to anything that is Active Directory integrated. Now, this access, as I said, this configuration management is done through GPOs. GPOs have two different portions. One of those portions exists in the LDAP server, and the other portion exists on the file server portion of AD. So domain controllers are also file servers, not only for sysvol, for GPOs, holding that configuration information that is downloaded to a Windows device as it boots up and looks through the domain, or when a person logs in to that device, but also the net logon share that holds all of the logon scripts for objects, whether that's users or computers, within a domain. The net logon share is more of a legacy setup. You won't see it used everywhere, but I still have seen logon scripts be used and stored here. An important thing to note is that the net logon share and the sysvol share are readable by everybody in the forest. So once again, if you have an active user account, you can start looking through the GPOs and logon scripts, even though you have no admin access. Now, on top of just being a normal file server, the domain controller is pushing and replicating all of the different logon scripts and GPOs between all of the different domain controllers. So it's doing file replication as well. And on top of that, it's also doing distributed file system, which is a way of putting an abstraction layer between a file system that exists on a server and the file system within an entire environment. So instead of hitting that individual domain controller file server by name only, you can connect to the domain name and then be routed to the closest server that is holding the information that you're looking for. So the domain controller is doing multiple things at the file server level as well. Now, on top of everything to do with users and groups, it also is a Kerberos key distribution center. This is how domain controllers can hand out Kerberos tickets for Kerberos Authentication to different users and computers. The next service is the Active Directory Web Services. This does two different functions as well. It seems to be popular for Microsoft to do more than one thing within a service. But the first is it is mainly used as a means to communicate with domain controllers with the PowerShell commandlets, whether that's to modify or query information. But it can also be used for different types of authentication on top of Kerberos, such as OAuth, etc. Now, the next thing that a domain controller is trying to do is it's trying to be a time server for all of the different computers in a forest. Now, the way this works is very regimented as to how you connect up and find and get one unified time, but it's very important that the time not be skewed between all the different devices within a domain, or Kerberos will start to fail. And that's why domain controllers are also time servers. The next one on the list, as I already covered, is DNS server. A domain controller may or may not be a DNS server depending on the environment. The last thing that's very important to know about domain controllers in Active Directory is that each domain controller is authoritative for the information it holds. They all think they are right. And they're all pushing the information to each other as changes happen. Now this is important for a couple of reasons. A, if you compromise one domain controller, you now have compromised the entire environment, right? It doesn't make a difference. You don't have to do each one individually. Next, if you can find a way to compromise one, you can push changes to the others because, once again, each one thinks that they're authoritative and have the rights to send that information to each other. Finally, it also has ramifications to the fact that you can't hide domain controllers. You can't separate domain controllers behind firewalls and have them talk to each other, right? Each one must be able to push changes to another domain controller. Now, it is possible to place domain controllers behind firewalls. However, because of everything they're trying to do and how they have to answer requests to each other and all the clients, there are a large number of ports that need to be open to domain controllers. And this is, once again, not just to the different clients on the network, but also to each other. As you see, there's about 21 ports up there plus all of the ephemeral ports. Large number. And you may not see all of these ports such as 53 DNS or also 5722 for DFSR, depending on the environment. But the rest are very common and you will see on every domain controller. Next up is the Authentication Protocols supported by Active Directory. At the bottom of the list is LANman. I mean, honestly, if a client is using LANman still, they probably are 100% compromised. It's such a very insecure protocol, it doesn't work, and it's really there for backward compatibility. It takes no time at all to crack the password hash and get a clear text password. Microsoft realized this, and way back when, I think with NTSP4, they released NTLM, which is a much better version of LANman, but still has multiple security issues. The first is, it's still relatively easy to crack an NTLM v1 password hash. It doesn't take a lot of time to do it. The next up is, even if you can't crack that password, you can actually just pass that NTLM hash, use that hash itself as an authentication method to talk with other Windows devices. Microsoft realized this was a problem and they released NTLM v2. NTLM v2 is an NTLM v1 hash plus a salt. Therefore, it's harder to crack, but still crackable. But more importantly, it can no longer be used in pass-the-hash techniques. You can't just send that NTLM v2 hash and have a Windows device accept it, or any device accept it. You have to crack the password hash to be able to use it, get that clear text password to be able to use the credentials. Now, when we look at how these things evolved, right, LAN Manager came out, then they NTLM, etc. It was with Windows 2003 that the default setting was changed to, use NTLM versus LAN Manager. And then when Microsoft released Windows 7 Server 2008, they changed it to, have the default be NTLM v2 for clients, but not for how servers respond. Okay, so all of your Windows clients on the network at this point should be trying to use NTLM v2, and they won't really downgrade, right? They only want to accept NTLM v2. That's the only way they're going to send their requests. But a server, on the other hand, will be more than happy to downgrade how it responds depending on the client. Most companies have not gone through the reconfiguration and setting changes on their Windows devices to make sure that servers only respond back, only accept NTLM v2. They'll be more than happy to downgrade if a client requests it. And this is something that you can use if you wish to attack different devices on the network, depending on what they're using. Next up on the main authentication methods are Kerberos at the very top. It's the most secure one, and it's a SERP-based method. It's following the typical Kerberos methodology, and we'll get into that in more detail later. Also on the list, there's LDAP and LDAP-S. They're not really authentication protocols, but they can kind of be. LDAP itself, everything is sent in clear text, so not very secure as it can be read through the network, but LDAP-S is using SERP-based encryption. Now, the thing is, even though domain controllers are trying to do so many different things, they're remarkably secure on their own, and so is Active Directory, right? It requires that you have a valid set of credentials to even begin with the lowest level permissions to start reading information out of AD, right? And unless somebody has installed extra services that aren't Active Directory related, or or missing security patches, it's very hard to just take direct access of a domain controller. Usually what happens is an attacker gains access to AD, admin access to AD or domain controllers by compromising other systems, right? The general strategy for attack is you find your domain, you find some sort of credentials, you see what that ID has rights to. If it doesn't have rights to anything, you start looking through AD to get more information to see who you want to attack, try and gain access to those accounts, gain access to privileged accounts, pivot around until you get admin access to domain controllers. Now, not domain admin access, just admin access in general. Now, why does this work? The reason that pen testers, and therefore attackers, can pivot around a Windows network is because of how companies typically segment their accounts, right? Usually what we see in environments are administrators have a normal account that they use to browse the internet, read email, write documents, etc. And then they have an admin account that they use to do anything else, whether that's be an admin on a workstation or an admin on a server or a domain admin, whatever it might be. They have two accounts. Heck, there's some environments where people still just have one account, and that is absolutely mind-blowing. But it doesn't work this way, right? Even back before Active Directory was released, back in 1999, Microsoft stated and started writing that this is not an effective way to do account segmentation. You need to have better separation between duties with accounts than this. And in 2005, they wrote an even stronger statement saying you have to segment your accounts better. And what they mean by that is something like this, where you do account tiering, right? You have a normal user account, and then maybe you have an account that does workstation admin functions, and a separate one for server admin, and then another one that's used to do administrative access to objects in a domain, and then finally a domain admin account that's only used to do domain admin functions, which are things like, promote a new domain controller, demote a domain controller, etc., not used in everyday use. And on top of that, none of these accounts should ever log on or interact with a device from a different tier, right? A server admin account should never be used on a workstation, right? And a domain admin account should only be used on domain controllers. But because no one ever follows this, and we start seeing accounts that have different levels of access shared on similar devices, it just takes compromising one of those lower level devices to gain access to something that has more rights or more privileges. And until this changes, until people start doing account tiering or start implementing something like just-in-time administration, just enough administration, really moving through a Windows environment is remarkably easy. At this point, we've completed the high-level overview of Active Directory. We've covered all the different components that exist in an implementation, some of the pitfalls of an environment, etc. And now it's time to really focus on attacking Active Directory. The first step in attacking Active Directory is actually finding the domain and domain controllers, right? Maybe you don't have any credentials, maybe you don't know anything about the environment, right? You've just plugged in your laptop and you're sitting on the network. Not really sure. But once again, the first step is finding that domain. Before we go looking for domains, let's talk about my lab environment. As you see depicted up on the screen, I have two different forests that are joined by an IntraForest Trust. The main forest and the more secure forest is Caesar.pvt that has a child domain called Julia.Caesar.pvt, and they have the typical inter-forest trust between them. And then on the other side of the intra-forest trust, joining two forests together, is Cleopatra.pvt. And just like in real life, one of the downfalls of Caesar is going to be Cleopatra. Cleopatra is not quite as secure as Caesar is. And so that's actually where we're going to be doing a lot of our work. And then I have my pen test laptop that has both a Kali instance as well as a general Windows attack host sitting on it. Now, one important thing to note about this entire environment is that all of my Windows devices are running Windows Server 2012 R2. This is very important because of a couple of different reasons. The first is that most of the environments that I've been in recently are using 2012 R2, or maybe still 2008 R2, and then in the process of moving to 2012 R2. Not many companies have started migrating their domains and domain functional levels to higher and newer versions. The other reason that this is important is Server 2012 R2 introduced a large number of security enhancements, both to Windows Server as well as Active Directory. There are group managed service accounts, there's better fine-grained password policy control, and when you log on to a Windows 2012 R2 server, it does not have your passwords in clear text, right? So we can't just use that portion of mimikatz to see clear text passwords. So lots of good reasons to be at 2012 R2, and if companies aren't there, you should definitely be urging them to upgrade as soon as they possibly can. So we've just plugged in our laptop, spun up our Kali instance, and it's time to start looking for domains and domain controllers. Unfortunately, in this first instance, we don't have any credentials, right? For whether the client did not give us any credentials or we just don't have the means to log in with them yet, whatever it might be, all we have is a random device attached to the network. This in itself is a problem for the client, yes, but it's now time for us to start searching for information. And we still want to find that domain because we want to be able to instantly start querying it for information as soon as we get credentials. So what can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is start looking for DNS information. By default, every Windows domain is going to have a record that is the same as the domain name. So in my case, there should be an A record for the Cleo-Attack.pvt domain. And it will respond back with a list of domain controllers that are there for that domain. However, this is not always the case, especially in situations where people are using bind as their DNS. And the reason is, as domain controllers are brought online, they all register an IP address under that one A record. It turns into like a round-robin type scenario. Not exactly, but that's kind of what it is. And what happens is in bind, unless things have been ACLed properly, what will happen is as devices dynamically update, extra things can get put in there, not just domain controllers. And actually, if it's wide open, that's another method of attacking that you can use. You could insert your own device into that A record. So in some cases, that won't exist. And then you have to move to SRV records. Every domain controller is going to register SRV records because that's how clients find them, right? So all it takes is loading NSLOOKUP, doing a set type equals all, and type in one of those two strings ending with the domain or forest name. Now, the second one in the list, the _tcp.gc, will find all domain controllers in the forest, but you have to specify the forest DNS name. So in my lab, where I have julia.caesar.pvt and caesar.pvt, I would have to specify caesar.pvt as the forest name. But it will list all the domain controllers and plus what domain they're in, which is very nice. The next one down will list domain controllers for the domain that you specify. Let's take a look at what searching DNS for domains and domain controller looks like. This is my Kali instance. It's a Linux box, of course, sitting on the same network. And so I'm going to use just DNS to try and find the domain and domain controllers for Caesar and Cleopatra. So NSLOOKUP is our friend, and I'm going to look for Cleopatra.pvt. And in this case, because I'm using Active Directory integrated zones, there it is. There's my Cleopatra.pvt, and here's the IP address of my domain controller. But let's say that doesn't work, right? For some reason, the A records don't exist for some reason. Well, then we move to SRV records. You have to set the type or it won't find it by default, and I type in that long string, and there you go. It has found the domain controllers, and in this case it didn't give me the IP address, but it gave me the name. And down here it said, hey, you can actually go to this domain controller or this DNS server to get more information. But here it is. I'm looking for it, and there's the DC. If I look for the forest, in this case, instead of the domain, which is what I searched for before, it gives me the same response because I only have one domain in that forest and only one domain controller in that domain. But if I would look for Caesar, it, remember, had a child domain, and it has more than one domain controller. So I'm looking for the forest in this case, as you see, gc, caesar.pvt, and I got 3 responses. The domain controller for Caesar, 1 and 2, and then also, hey, there is a subdomain in this forest called julia.caesar.pvt, and here's the domain controller for it. So The other thing that you can do is once you find a domain controller, you can connect to LDAP and look at some limited information. You're not going to be able to get really any information about user accounts or anything specific like that unless they've modified the default security. But you can find out some pieces of information about the Active Directory environment. Things like the domain and forest functional level, the different partitions that it has, and some other general security information. Now, once you have this, you still want to get credentials. One option you would have to harvest credentials, and the one I would turn to, is to run a poisoner. A poisoner is a little utility that is running in the background and answers any multicast name request that happens to float through the network and it sees. Basically, the poisoner will say, yep, that is me. I am server 1. Please authenticate to me. And then when the Windows client does so, the poisoner will grab the user ID as well as the NTLM v1 or v2 hash that happens to be given to it. Then you could take that hash and you can crack it offline, or if it's a down-level version of NTLM, you can then use it and pass the hash techniques. Responder and Inve are both types of poisoners. Responder is included in Kali and is built and maintained by Laurent Gaffey. Inve is a PowerShell version made by Kevin Robertson. Now, the reason these work so effectively is most companies have not turned off the feature that allows Windows to try and be smart and help you as you're looking for different resources on the network. Basically, as a user goes in to start run and starts typing in whack server name /share, in the background, the Windows client is trying to find a device that matches that name for each letter as they're putting it in. That way, when they go to that whack server name whack, it can list the shares for them. So each one of those is a multicast name request that's passed through the local network, and the poisoner will pick it up and respond as if they are that device. Now, if you compromise a Windows system, get a remote shell, or some other activity, your options for finding information about the domain and domain objects really grows exponentially. Windows comes with a variety of different command line utilities that give you this information not only about the device itself, but also the domain and the user account that you might be using at that moment. Now, the first one in the list, Who Am I, is the one that everybody knows already. You type it in and it gives you the domain that the user account is a member of and the user account that you're currently logged in with. However, there are systems and utilities and companies that flag this as malicious activity because no one needs to really run this anymore. Unless you're doing lots of run-as activities, it's not very commonplace. So this actually is flagged as a potential malicious activity. So let's look at some of the other options you have. There's System Info. This is a great utility to run when you land on a Windows device. It gives you the computer name, the domain name that it's connected to, the domain controller it's connected to, the domain, etc., as well as all the information about the system itself. GP Result, another great utility. Not only will it give you the domain that the computer is connected to, but also the user account that is currently logged in, the OU that the user account is in, domain controller name, the group names that the user are a member of, and this is fairly innocuous. This computers processing GPOs is something that happens all the time. Maybe not through GP Result, but the act of it just processing GPOs is very normal. You can also get a variety of information from the environment variables. You could type set and get all of them, or you could just use echo or the environment variable within PowerShell to pick out specific ones. The ones I highlight here are computer name, logon server, user DNS domain, username. They're all important, right? The computer name not only tells you the computer you're on, but it also gives you an idea of what computer accounts are named like, right? How workstations or servers are named, because you might need that later on if you're trying to spoof one of those names or create a fictitious computer account. The logon server, right? That's your domain controller that the device is connected to. User DNS domain and user domain. Now, it's important to look at both of these, because depending how you interact with the domain, sometimes you send the short name and sometimes you send the fully qualified DNS name. And an interesting fact, these two do not need to match. They most often do, right? If it's corp.com, typically the short name is going to be corp as well. But this is something that is manually chosen at the time when the domain is created. A good example of this is one of the domains I supported at Bank of America. back in the late 2000s, Bank of America had acquired MBNA, and the forest and domain that was brought along with that acquisition was mbna.com, I believe. However, for some reason, the short name was not MBNA, it was IGLB. So, once again, depending on how you're interacting with the domain, sometimes you might want to specify the short name, which would have been IGLB, or other times you might want to specify the long name, the fully qualified name, in which case it would be mbna.com. So, once again, it's important to know both the short name and the long name. And then finally, the last example I gave down there is a getWMI object, which will once again give you the domain name and the domain controller that the device is connected to. Now, there's another command that you could use to start getting information about domains and forests, and it's called nltest. This command is often overlooked because it was really only used by Active Directory administrators for diagnostics and troubleshooting any sort of domain issues that are happening at the time. But because of what it was created for, as expected, it can give you lots of detailed information. The first one on the list there, the domain trusts or trusted domains either will work, will show you all of the other domains the current domain you're connected to trusts. Once again, any domain that is trusted or part of a trust relationship starts expanding the security boundary further and further in other locations that you can start looking at information and potentially start attacking. The /primary flag there, if you add that, it will show you what domain the computer you are using is connected to. Without it, it shows you all of the trusted domains. The next item on the list, the SC query, that will show you the domain controller the computer account is currently connected to. The DC list does just that. It will list all the domain controllers in a domain. dsget site, this is another interesting one. This one will show you the site that your computer account is in. Now, a site is a method of a replication boundary. It's a way of making sure that devices go to the closest domain controller to them network-wise. This is important because there are going to be times when you are going to be querying the domain for information, and if you just use the raw domain name as what you want to connect to, you may go across the world or across the continent depending on how big the network is. So dsget site will give you the site that you're in and domain controllers that you can then attach to that are close to you. The last one on the command is just a quick little fun one, the nltest who will. That will show you if an account is actually in the domain. It's probably not something you're going to use, but a nice little tidbit of knowledge. Up until now, we've just been really covering trying to find domains that are in the environment, your situational awareness. But let's now start focusing in on trying to find the targets that you actually want to compromise so that you can start gaining access to data and other systems. Once I have a little bit of information about a domain and a set of credentials for that domain, even if they're absolutely unprivileged, I go ahead and do my first attack against a very common Active Directory weakness. What I do is I make my own attack host. Endpoints typically are very well protected, right? They're running antivirus, perhaps they have firewalls, any number of things that make it very difficult for us to use them as methods to attack other devices or run our own utilities, right? Why even try and bother with any of that if you could just bypass it completely and add your own Windows client to the domain that has all of the utilities you want to use on it and no antivirus, right? You completely bypass that first set of controls. And this is something that is remarkably easy to do. I have the steps listed there, and I'll actually show how this works. So this device here, Cleo-Attack, is my Windows attack host. It is running Windows Server 2012 R2, and currently it's part of the temp work group. Now, I named it Cleo-Attack because we're going to say I did a little bit of recon and found that other devices sitting in the Cleopatra domain are prefaced with Cleo-something. Admitted in a real pen test, I probably would not give it a name as obvious as attack, but because I'm going to be doing multiple demos with this device, I want to have a name that I can track easily. On Cleo-Attack, you'll see that there are a variety of different tools that would be flagged by any antivirus product out there, things like mimikatz, PowerView. These are known malicious tools, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to join it to the domain, I'm going to use the GUI because I'm a former Windows guy, and we didn't believe in doing anything in command line. Just applying my password, and boom, it's part of the Cleopatra domain. I have now created something that is trusted. However, before I restart, what I want to do is I want to do a couple of other things to this device because I want to be sure that only I'm an administrator on it. So I'll quickly come in here. I'm going to say, hey, we're going to remove domain admins, and we're going to add Cleopatra user 1 as an administrator. And I have to specify my password again here so it can do the lookup in the domain. All right, and there we go. So now Cleopatra, this user account, is an administrator. Nobody else is, so that way they can't just automatically log in and see what's happening. And I'm going to say OK. Yep. And restart. And as it's restarting, I'll show you that the user account that I used is just a normal account. We'll say this is one that was created by the administrators for the test. So generic user, here he is, user 1, and he is a member of just domain users. Now, the reason this entire thing works so well is because using the default join method puts the device in the default computer's container. Being in the computer's container is important because of how GPOs are applied to devices and policies are pushed down to devices in a domain. GPOs themselves can be attached to the domain level or an OU or a site, but they cannot be attached to a container. Therefore, since our attack computer is now sitting in the computer's container, the only policy that can be pushed down to it are things at the top level of the domain, cleopatra.pvt. And these are your least common denominator settings, things that can be applied to any device in the domain. And typically, that's only the password policy for the domain. Therefore, being in the container, we're not getting anything special, right? It's just the high-level settings. Now, as a quick warning, you want to be careful when you do this. You do not want to attach like a physical device to the network. Make sure it's a VM. The reason is, while the default location is the computer's container, administrators can change this. A couple years ago, I did this trick for a client. I joined my computer and I started running rampant through their environment because there were no controls. And instead of just blocking the setting that allows a user to join a computer to the domain, they decided to change the default location of where computer objects are stored. And instead of being in the container, they forced it down to a very restricted OU. And once my new device joined and rebooted, it instantly started rebooting every single time. As soon as it came up, they forced that setting instead of just changing it. So basically, my attack device would boot up, it would get a policy that said, hey, you need to restart. And that's all it did over and over and over again. So be careful, be sure that you only join a VM to the domain. Now, the other important thing is, why do I do this so early? Well, trying to join a computer to the domain is fairly innocuous. It's probably not being audited. They're probably not alerting on it, even if it is, right? All I'm trying to do is a normal behavior, just join a computer to the domain. There's an optional step you can take once the attack host reboots and you log back into it. And you log in and you make sure that it's not constantly rebooting or doing something strange because the domain admins have done something tricky in their environment. But that is that you can remove the service principal name from the computer object. We're going to talk about Kerberos a little bit more later on, but it's important to know that in order for people and other devices to authenticate via Kerberos to your attack host, it must have the SPN host/device name. If that's gone, all the devices can only use is NTLM Authentication. At this point, I would typically say you don't want to remove the SPNs unless you are using utilities that absolutely require only NTLM Authentication. This entire attack, and I'm using air quotes around the word attack, works because of a setting within the default domain controller's policy, GPO. By default, when you create the domain, NT authority authenticated users have the permission to add workstations to the domain. And what this means is that anybody in the forest, not just the domain, anybody in the forest has the ability to join up to 10 devices to the domain. This setting is often overlooked for a couple of reasons. One, it could be the name, add workstations to the domain. People feel as if that's how it is given and that right is granted to people, but in reality, that should be all handled through ACLs on individual OUs. The other reason, as I said, it's a default setting. It may not have been looked at, and really, it's not often called out unless Microsoft comes in and does a review of your settings. And even they don't consider this a high-level risk, right? For this to be exploited, an attacker needs to be on your network already. So not considered a major risk, but when you use this in conjunction with the fact that typically no one sets policies, at the domain level, and the computer object is put in the default computer's container, you now have a device that you can use to run any utility you want, and you don't have to worry about client-side protections. Let's say you can't join your attack host to the domain and you still want to start searching Active Directory. Well, you have a variety of options. You could start pulling down other utilities and tools like PowerView or things like that and start running them on the device that you compromised. However, they may be detected or be blocked. Okay, there are some interesting things that can be done in PowerShell to change what commands PowerShell can run. There's something called constrained language mode, which forces PowerShell to only use signed commandlets, right? Therefore, things like PowerView and other utilities or calling the .NET system libraries themselves will start to fail, right? And you still want to be able to search Active Directory. Now, the tools aren't installed on hosts or servers by default, right? The Active Directory users and computers functionality or the Active Directory commandlets aren't there. But that doesn't stop you from being able to use them. If you want to do the manual AD search method, all you have to do is run a little run DLL 32 command, and it will open the search window and then start giving you details. Or if you want to use PowerShell, which is what I recommend, you can just copy the Microsoft.ActiveDirectory.management DLL down to the server and import it and then start running PowerShell searches. This will not be flagged as malicious on its own. It is a signed Microsoft DLL. It is running AD commandlets, so they are signed, and it will still continue to function even if the client is using PowerShell version 5 and they've reduced the functionality down to constrained language mode. So, two quick little methods that you can start searching AD even if the host itself does not have the tools installed. Now that you have the ability to start searching AD, what do you actually want to look for? Well, at a high level, I'm not going to cover everything. These are things that I would definitely look for. You want to look for anybody who has administrative access to Active Directory. And of course, this contains the enterprise admins and domain administrators. But you should also look at the built-in administrators group. And then some other ones that aren't often thought of, right? Account operators, backup operators, print operators, server operators. All of these groups have some level of access to domain controllers or objects within the domain, right? Backup operators, print operators, and server operators all have the ability to log into domain controllers by default, right? So they may not be administrators, but they can definitely do something, even if it's log on and try and exploit, 0 days or find some way of escalating their privileges, right? Backup operators on their own, anybody who's a member of that group, could take a backup of your domain controller and copy it somewhere else, take it offline, export it, and start looking at the data in your DIT, right? So that in itself is a problem. Server operators by default have the ability to stop and start services, potentially install things. So even though they are not absolutely domain administrators, they have the ability to start doing things on domain controllers. Account operators, another group that's not often looked at. Anybody who is a member of that group has the ability to modify almost any user or group within the domain. And I say almost any because there are some high-level users, such as members of enterprise admins, domain admins, etc., that they can't modify. But they can start modifying membership to other groups, right? You don't need to be a domain admin to gain access to sensitive data if you can add your user ID into the group that grants that access, right? It's not quite as good as domain admin, but it's still a level of access that starts getting you what you really want. The built-in administrators group, very important one. This group, even though you're not necessarily have the rights of a domain admin, you can grant yourself those rights. It's like being an administrator on a server. So all of those, very important to look at. You also want to look at the, any group that has the name admin or admins in it, right? Who the members of those are. Administrators typically name things like, server admins or workstation admins, etc. These are groups that you want to look at or look for because they might give you permissions on other devices. So you want to look for your admin accounts, regardless of what group they're in. You also want to look at the ACLs assigned to different OUs and at the domain level. You want to see who has the write ability to objects. You want to see who has the replicate directory changes right. This one is very important. Any ID or computer that has the replicate directory changes permission can do just that. They can pull information from any object in the domain and get that information, including the password hashes. And we'll do a quick demo of that. So here I am logged into my Cleo-Attack server with user 1, who remember has no special permissions. And one of the first things I'm going to look at is at the ACLs of the top level domain object. Go in, look at the properties, and look at security. As a quick note, before you do this, be sure that you have advanced features turned on if you're going to use ADUC, because if you don't have this feature turned on, you can't see the ACLs, the security principles. So I'm going to look at the top level, go to the security tab, and go to advanced. And then I look right here, and I see at the top level, I see that there's this account, DirSync, that has replicate directory changes. All right, so top level of the domain has this permission. Let's assume I somehow find where this account is, I log into that server, and I want to then use this functionality to grab something very important, the password hash for the KRB TGT account, which we will talk about in more detail. But this account is not an administrator. He has no special rights, but all it takes is running mimikatz and one command within it, the LSA dump DC sync command, specifying who you want it to sync. And as you see, it went through and it grabbed the information for the KRB TGT account, including the password hash. We'll deal with this a little bit later. But once again, that account having just that right gives it the ability to pull any information you want out of Active Directory if you can get to that account. Now, you don't want to just look for accounts and computers, right? There are other things in Active Directory that are incredibly useful as well. One example could be special sites, right? Companies that have a lockdown environment, like a CDE environment or a special set of servers that are holding HIPAA data, whatever it might be, might have them declared in a special site within Active Directory. If you go through and enumerate the sites, you get the names of them, and you might get some information as sometimes administrators don't obfuscate names. I mean, lots of things in Active Directory are not obfuscated. To do so would make it less useful, right? It's supposed to be an open directory of information. So if you can look at the site, you can enumerate the subnets attached to that site, which is the next item, subnets. In order to make sure that Windows devices or devices using Active Directory go to the closest domain controller when they're doing authentication or queries or whatever they might be doing, Active Directory administrators need to input all of the subnets in their company's network into Active Directory. This way, when a device logs in, it says, oh, my IP address is 192.168.1.7. That means I go into site A, because that's where I'm associated, and I use domain controller A, right? So the subnets not only tell you, what their site they're attached to, and maybe that's an important site, but it can also help you find all of the different networks used by this company to make sure that you have complete coverage when you're doing something like a vulnerability scan. You also want to dump out an entire list of all the active user accounts in the domain, right? maybe you want to go do password spraying, which we'll talk about in a little bit, right? You need a list of those user accounts if you're going to start interacting with them. And then I also like to get a complete list of all the different computer accounts and server accounts in the domain, just to help me find different devices that I want to start attacking. And once again, you want to make sure they're active computer accounts. Not every organization has a very good cleanup and retention policy when it pertains to computer objects in AD. So if you grab everything, you could get a lot of false positives. Before I go any further, I want to talk about mimikatz, which is the utility I used back in the DirSync demo. Mimikatz is a wonderful tool written by Benjamin Depley. It's the Swiss Army knife of dealing with Windows security and Windows authentication. Not only can it be used to extract information out of AD, it can be used to do pass the hash techniques or pass the ticket, dump clear text passwords out of a device's memory, etc. It really is the go-to utility, and it's included in a variety of other tools and scripts. It goes without saying that while mimikatz is an incredibly important tool within your tool belt during a red team assessment or a pen test, you do have to be careful where and when you use it. Any AV product out there, and almost any endpoint control product, is going to flag this as malicious and start sending alerts. So be careful where you use it, where you store it, but absolutely be very familiar with it if you're going to start interacting with AD or Windows security. I've included a variety of just sample AD searches that all leverage the AD commandlets in PowerShell. I know that PowerShell is becoming less popular with pen testers because of all the different controls and auditing that can be put in place now with PowerShell 5. However, I still feel, especially when searching for information out of Active Directory, PowerShell is a great utility, right? Number one, if you use the AD modules, right, and AD commandlets, you're not going to be doing anything malicious, right? So even if the administrators have turned on the constrained language mode, these will all still run. The second thing is, from what I have seen, even if administrators have turned on auditing of PowerShell, they're just storing it, right? Especially on client devices. Maybe on servers, they're actually, alerting on specific things. But as far as client devices, they're just auditing it and holding it there so that if something else triggers an alert, the administrators or the blue team, whoever it is, can go in and start looking at what attackers might have used PowerShell for. But they're not necessarily alerting off of it itself. So here are the basic searches that I have. The first one is the get AD object that filters on admin account equals 1. Any ID that is a member of very privileged groups, such as domain admins, enterprise admins, etc., have an extra bit in the admin count. They have an admin count of 1. This, number one, identifies them as important, but also is a method that a secondary process can go through and find specific objects to make sure they have specific security ACLs assigned to them. So that's one way of finding all of the high privileged accounts within AD, but it won't necessarily tell you what group they're a member of, right? You won't know if that's a domain administrator or if it's an account operator. The next search, get AD group, I have it filtered to find all of the groups, security groups, that have a name like admin. Now, when you're writing an AD query, you want to make it as specific as possible, right? I could have just said, find any AD object, right, that has a name like admin. However, that could be flagged as inefficient by the domain controller because I'm looking at too many records or I've done something wrong. So you always want to make your searches as tight as possible, as close to what you're looking for. So then I also have something to give you all the sites that are used in a forest, all the subnets, a list to give you all of the active users and pipe them out to a CSV file, and then a little script that will give you all of the active computers. A computer is considered active if it's changed its password in the last month. Just as another little side note, computers have passwords, right? Computer accounts and computers have passwords just like users do. And they initiate a password change every 30 days on their own. There's nothing that needs to happen, and they change their own password. So if a computer has not changed its password in over 30 days, it is most likely not active. And then I wrote a little script that will enumerate all of the OUs and tell you what the ACLs and permissions are on those OUs if they're different from the one above it, and that's the link to that script. Now, there's another thing you can search Active Directory for, and that is applications installed on workstations and servers. As I had mentioned before, in order for Kerberos Authentication to work properly, an application must have a service principal name, or SPN. Therefore, if you query and dump all of the SPNs in a domain, you can begin to see what applications are installed there if they're configured to use Kerberos. There's two different utilities that I have mentioned there. The first is a command line utility called setSPN, and the second is a PowerShell query using getADObject. But once you get the entire list, you can start looking through them and to see what is installed on servers. Every Windows device is going to have a host SPN, so you want to ignore that. That is used for file sharing and things like that. They're probably going to also have a WSMAN entry, which is used for PowerShell remoting and Windows remote management. But other ones are interesting, such as SQL Server or Exchange Database or web servers, right? So these SPNs can be assigned to either computer objects or to user objects, depending on how they're configured. A computer object will have the SPN if the application is running as system, right? And a user object will have the SPN if it is assigned to a service account. If you don't want to write your own PowerShell queries or other utilities, there are some that you can go out there and get already that will search Active Directory. The first is PowerView. PowerView is a great set of tools included in PowerSploit, which was written by Matt Graber and Will Schroeder. And it essentially runs net commands and other methods of getting information and returns them in PowerShell objects. PowerView itself is typically not flagged as malicious, even though other portions of PowerSploit will be. PowerView is also included in Cleo-Attack, which was written by Jared Haight. It's a great utility that allows you to run PowerShell attacks, known malicious attacks, but not use PowerShell itself. It creates its own executable that interacts as if it was PowerShell, but it's not. And then there's Empire, formerly known as PowerShell Empire, that is another command and control system. It includes PowerView, but it does a lot more than just that. When talking about tools that gather information out of Active Directory, you have to include Bloodhound. Bloodhound was written by Andrew Robbins, Will Schroeder, and many others, and it is an incredible utility that not only will get information out of AD, but helps you build relationships with those different objects and permissions and other things, such as where users are logged in. And it does all of this, and it gives you a visual map and can be helped to find the pathways between objects, where they're logged in and what path you should take to try and get to your final destination, whether that's a domain admin or administrative access to whatever it may be. It does require multiple components. One of those parts is called the ingester, and that is a script or a program you run on a device in the domain you want to map, and it will gather all of the Active Directory information, and it will also, unless you change its behavior, go out and query every single device in the domain to see who is currently logged on to that device. Then you take all of that data that was gathered by the ingester and you import it into a NeoJ database, and you run the Bloodhound executable, and it builds a visual map. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Bloodhound itself because it could really take up a class all on its own. But I wanted to give you a quick view of what the visualization looks like. So I imported all of the data using the ingesters, and here is a quick look. As you can see, you can find groups. You can search for different groups and objects within the domain, and it will give you some details about them, such as where they might be logged in, where they have administrative rights, etc. But really, it's some of these queries that are the best. Pre-built ones, and you can make your own, but there's things like find all the domain admins, and here are all the domain admins for Julia, Cleopatra, and Caesar. You can see them all listed. You can find more information. It doesn't work for me in this case because of how my environment is set up, but you can also have it try and find the shortest path. This one did work. You can also try and do it specifically by saying, hey, here is my user that I have an access to and I want to get to domain admins. Is there a path? And if one exists, it will show you that path that says something like, you're here, log into this computer account. Then that will give you access to this account, which then gives you access to this computer where a domain admin is logged in, etc. You don't always want to search for domain admins. You also want to search for individual devices. I have found situations where I can't find a path to domain admins, but I can find it to the domain controller itself, having admin access to the domain controller. So one quick little tidbit. Bloodhound is an incredible tool, giving you that visual representation of the objects in Active Directory and the relationships between them and active sessions, etc. However, you should be aware of a couple of things before you use it. Number one, the ingesters themselves. There's a PowerShell version and a compiled version. The PowerShell version may not work on devices that are using constrained language mode. In addition, both versions, when they make all of those connections to the different devices in a domain, have the possibility of trigger network detections, right? I've had a couple of situations where this has happened. One, the client had alerting set up that it was monitoring connections to multiple devices through NetFlow data as well as endpoint connection firewalls, right? Who's trying to connect to the individual firewalls. It was quite remarkable. But once I started Bloodhound, they instantly saw when the device started querying for all those different sessions, right? And they flagged down my attack host immediately. The second time it was caught was by a client that was monitoring all of the different DNS queries being made by devices on their network. When a certain number of queries were made by one device in X amount of time, it flagged it as something to go look at, right? So Bloodhound is a great utility, but it may not always be the right tool to use depending on what controls clients have in their environment. The next thing you want to really search for are clear text IDs and passwords stored within Active Directory on the domain controllers. There are two main locations that you can search for this. One is within the net logon share. Check within the different logon scripts that might be there and see if any clear text IDs and passwords exist. This does not happen very often, and I can only think of one occasion where it has. And even then, they actually weren't using logon scripts in that case. What had happened is this company had decided to use the net logon share as a method to store all of their device build files. Since domain controllers replicate all this data around to all of the other domain controllers in the environment, the administrators found this a great location to make sure that build files for devices were everywhere they needed to be and close to the different clients when they were being built and prepped. So I was able to find some clear text information in there. But once again, not very common to use logon scripts, let alone find information at logon. So it takes no time at all to just quickly browse out or map a drive to the net logon share in the domain controller and see what's there. The next one that you can search for is within GPOs themselves. This is kind of an interesting story, but back in 2008, Microsoft added something called group policy preferences to GPOs. And this allowed admins to store credentials in different GPO settings, such as mapping drives or creating local users on servers, printer configurations, scheduled tasks, changing the local administrator password, etc., a variety of different things. Now, when Microsoft created it, they made sure that the passwords were encrypted using AES 256, right, stored in XML files in sysvol. But then 4 years later, someone at Microsoft, I believe because they were trying to help someone troubleshoot a problem with group policy preferences, actually published the key to MSDN. And suddenly it was out in the wild and everybody was able to get it. 2 years later, Microsoft released a patch that prevented people from being able to create new or store credentials within new group policy preferences. However, this patch did not do anything to remove those GPP settings in the XML files in sysvol. So every once in a while, you can find a clear text password within a GPO. You could write your own script, or you could use a script within PowerSploit, which is what I have on the screen, the get GPP password. And it will go through all of the different XML files in sysvol and look for passwords and give them to you in clear text. Now, what it does not do is tell you what devices those actually work for. So if you notice, when you run GPP password, it tells you that, hey, this file, which is a GPO file, has it. But then what you need to take is that GUID stored there, right in the center, where that 8A0, and put that into another query, and it will tell you the OU that this GPO is applied to. And then you can look at that OU or any child OUs for devices in there and know what to log on to with that information that you got from get GPP password. Now that you have a list of user accounts out of Active Directory, it's time to see which ones have weak passwords so that you can start adding them to your list of credentials to start pivoting around with and gaining access to extra data or systems or whatever it might be. And the way you do this is by password spraying. Password spraying is a method of attempting to log into a device or a system with every single user account with one password that you specify. And you specify common passwords, right? Things that are kind of weak but are used almost everywhere. Good examples include winter 2018, or at this point maybe I'd use winter 2019, or maybe winter 2019 exclamation point, or password 123, or the company name. Any of these are very common things that we see used over and over again. There was one client that we had where we ran the password spraying, we used the season year option. We got 50% of the environment at that one hit, not just regular user IDs, but also admin IDs. And that's because when someone called into the help desk to have them reset their password because they forgot it, right? The user reset their password on a Friday, came in on Monday and couldn't remember what happened. The help desk would reset their password to that idea, right? Winter 2018. It works because it meets all of the default complexity requirements for Microsoft, right? It has an upper, a lower, a number, and if you even require that extra, special character like an exclamation point. But the help desk would set this, the people would go, this is a great idea. I'm always going to remember my password because I have to change it 4 times a year, every 90 days, and that matches with a season. And that's what they started doing all the time. So this is something that we find almost all the time. Maybe you don't get another administrator ID, but you're guaranteed to get at least one additional set of credentials that you can use and start pivoting around with. Before you start password spraying, it's very important that you know what the password policy is before you start, right? Now, prior to Windows 2012, really prior to 2008 R2, but it wasn't really used until 2012 R2, all you had to know was the default password policy. And you can get that by running get AD default domain policy, as I said. And that will tell you things like how many bad password attempts can be done to an account before it's locked out and how long it will stay locked out for. However, now they're fine-grained password policies. This is where it gets a little bit more tricky. Unless you are a domain admin, you cannot see what fine-grained password policies exist in a domain or what their settings are. Okay? But you can see if anybody has a fine-grained password policy assigned to them, linked to them. And that's what that second query is. If you run that, it will tell you, right, that there is a fine-grained policy, password policy, and it's assigned to this group or this user. Unfortunately, you won't know what it's set to. So I would take great care in doing any sort of password spraying to those IDs. I would probably remove them from the list because there's a potential that the password policy is much more restrictive, right? It all depends from what those group names. It might give you some sort of idea of what's happening. But my best recommendation is to remove any IDs that fall into that fine-grained password policy issue. At the bottom, I listed two different utilities you can use to run password spraying attacks. The first is in Metasploit. It's the SMB login utility. And the second is CrackMapExec, built by Black Hill Security. This is a great utility, not only for doing password spraying, but also searching file shares for information and doing a variety of other attacks. There are multiple other tools out there that can be used for password spraying. These are just two that I wanted to highlight. Before we move on into how you can abuse the different authentication protocols used by Active Directory, I wanted to highlight something about account segmentation again. I had mentioned a while ago how you should never allow an ID that has more permissions to interact with a device of a lower tier, right? Lower security tier. So you should not have a domain admin account be used in any way, shape, or form on a member server. So in this example, I've logged into Clio server, which we've seen before. It's just a member server within the domain Cleopatra. I logged in with the backup admin account because if you noticed from my Git GPP example and slide, we found that there was an ID called backup admin, and we got the password for it out of a GPO. So being a crafty pen tester, I logged into this device with that ID. Once I've logged in, I'm going to quickly look at what the services are, and I'll do this via the graphical method instead of through PowerShell, just because it's easier to see. But as I look, I'll notice, hey, there's this bad service listed here, and it's running as Nessus at Cleopatra.com. Now, I've already done my mapping. I know who the domain admins are, but just to refresh everybody, we'll see that Nessus is a domain admin. All right, so the user in this case is not a user that is logged in, right? It's not a person who is physically logged into the device. However, it is a user account on this server, this member server, that has domain admin rights. And therefore, I can exploit this and make it do something I want. Now, there's a tool within PowerSploit called Invoke Service Abuse that we're going to use for this. You have to run administrator or PowerShell as administrator because that's how you should run it anyways all the time, right? So let me change over really fast to the directory. Import the module for PowerSploit. And all I'm going to do, very simple thing, all I'm going to do is I'm going to say find the service, bad service 2, and then invoke service abuse and pass it this command. All I'm asking it to do is add a user account, user2, to the domain admins group. I have to be an administrator so I can actually have it stop and start the service. And there it goes. It says, hey, the service was abused. I did it for you. And now if I query the domain, you'll see user2 is now in there. This is just highlighting that it doesn't make a difference what type of account it is, right? A service account or somebody's admin account. You cannot allow accounts with more privileges to access a lower tiered environment. This issue here has caught people more than anything else. And this issue with a service catches people all the time, right? People who write applications like to say it needs to run as domain admin because they feel that's the easiest way to make sure it has rights to everything in the domain. No one should ever run utilities that affect member servers or workstations as domain admin. Invoke service abuse is not the only tool that can do this same type of attack, right? It's just the one I used in the demo. For example, if you have an interpreter shell on a server and it has a process running as a domain admin, you can inject into that process, migrate into it, and then run any commands that you want, right? It's all about exploiting the lack of account tiering. But now that we've covered that in detail as well as getting information out of Active Directory, it's time to move on to how you can actually exploit the different security protocols used by Active Directory, things like NTLM and Kerberos. First, we're going to talk about NTLM because it's the weaker of the two protocols. The way NTLM works is all challenge-based, right? So basically what happens is a user on their workstation over here wants to access a file on the server. And when they go to do so, the computer sends a request over to the server that says, hey, I want to access you. The server then generates a number called the challenge, sends it back to the client. The client encrypts this with their password, with the user's password, sends it over to the server. The server, not shown in the diagram, then sends this encrypted blob up over to a domain controller that verifies what it's supposed to be, right? And if it matches, it tells the server everything's okay, and the server says, I believe you, come on in. Because of how NTLM works, and it's all challenge-based, right? Really just interactions between the client and the server up until the very end, it's very easy to abuse. My favorite method is the SMB Relay Process. As you'll notice, it looks remarkably similar to how NTLM is functioning in the first place. But what's happened is there's a malicious thing in the middle that's just forwarding these requests and responses back and forth. What happens is a pen tester or an attacker sets their device down on the network, and they open the SMB relay connection to a target device, a member server, or something that they want to have admin access on, or they want to run a command on. And it sits there, and this device just waits and waits and waits until people connect to it. Now, this could be a user trying to connect to a file share, or more likely, it's going to be something that's running some sort of credentialed scan on all the devices in the network. In most environments, because they want to be able to connect to every device, these types of systems, vulnerability scanners or network scanners, whatever it might be, typically run under domain admin or incredibly high privileged accounts, right? That way they can log into everything and move on. So what happens is, we'll say this is a Nessus credentialed scan. Nessus reaches out, finds our malicious attack device and says, hey, I want to connect to you to get information. Our malicious device forwards that on, that request, to our target server and says, hey, can I access you as Nessus? The member server says, oh, okay, sure. Encrypt this little blob with your password hash. Our attack device sends that back to Nessus saying, hey, will you encrypt this for me? Nessus says, yep, here it is. Our device forwards that on back to the server saying, here it is. The server says, oh, yep, I believe you. And then Kali, or our attack device in this case, sends it back to Nessus and says, here, I'm sorry, you don't have access. But what it really did is it ran some sort of predetermined command by the attacker against that member server. So let's see the SMB relay in action. There are multiple components to this, and I'll explain each one as we go through it. But the first is our target device, which happens to be Clio Server, right? We know that Clio Server has something special on it, whether that's a domain admin that's logged into it, or a service running domain admin, or an application that we need access to. We're not sure what at this point, but we know we need to get access to it. Unfortunately, our user 1 account is not an administrator, so we really can't do anything right now. We decide at this point we're going to set up an SMB relay because we haven't found any other methods to exploit. So the SMB relay I'm going to use is called multi-relay, and it's part of Responder, which is installed on every Kali instance by default. I've changed my directory to user share responder tools, which is where multi-relay sits. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask multi-relay to target our server, Clio server, which is 192.168.0.16, and try and forward on any connections that it gets. When multi-relay now makes its connection, it reaches out and it tries to connect to Clio server, and it says, yes, I can work because SMB signing is not enabled on Clio server, and then I can get some information out of it. If you run multi-relay and you don't get all of this information here, it means something is blocking the communication and multi-relay won't work. So what happens now is our attack box is just sitting here waiting for something to connect to it. If an unprivileged user connects, like let's say user 1 right now because he doesn't have any access to Clio server, tries to connect, you'll see he gets an error message. And multi-relay tried to forward it, right here. It caught it, and it said that it sent the authentication, but it says, oh, it is now a low privileged user. That's not going to work for us. So it just sits there and waits again. But if somebody who does have admin access to Clio server attempts to connect to our Kali box, in this case it's going to be a domain admin because that's what I have available, you'll see it happened. What happened is immediately multi-relay caught it, sent the challenge, said, hey, Cleopatra is here, its credentials, it's an admin. Awesome, I'm going to drop into an interactive shell. This is special to multi-relay. Not all tools have this. But what happens is now you can run a variety of different commands if you want. They give you an example. I'm just going to run one special one that says, hey, add user 1 to the local administrators group. If we go in, we'll see there we are. Now we can start interacting with it. It's important to note that multi-relay has this special shell, which will let you do multiple things, run mimikatz, run other commands, do almost anything you want. However, the shell itself often gets caught by endpoint protections. And there are other tools out there that can do the same thing. They won't have the shell, but they'll still run a command. Multi-relay itself doesn't have to drop to the shell. It could run other commands for you, like connect into Metasploit or into PowerShell Empire, whatever you might want it to do. Another important thing to know about any SMB relay is that even if we don't have admin access with the IDs, when you connect in, when somebody connects to the SMB relay, it still captures the NTLM hash or NTLM v2 hash, which then you can take offline and start cracking, even if it didn't have admin access to the box. Another important thing to know about SMB relays are that they sit here and work and they're passive. They just wait for someone to connect to them and then forward those authentication requests onto the target. But they can work in conjunction with Responder or other tools, right, those poisoners, to get more credentials. So then what happens is multi-relay is waiting, and anytime Responder picks up on one of those multicast requests, it not only grabs the hash, but it forwards it on to the target as well. This turns the SMB relay process into less of a passive waiting game and more of an active attack. And that's very important to a pen test, more so than to a real attacker. An attacker could sit there and wait forever for that process, that Nessus scan to come in and connect to his attack host. Pen testers, we typically have about a week, right? So anything we can do to get more credentials forwarded onto our target, the better. Unlike NTLM, which is completely challenge and response based, Kerberos is certificate based. And it's actually a lot more secure than NTLM, but it does have a couple of issues in ways that it can be exploited. But before we can talk about that, let's just run through how Kerberos Authentication works. When a user logs in, their information is sent to the domain controller, right? And if everything checks out, their password, etc., matches what is expected by the domain controller, the DC will respond back with a special certificate called a TGT, a ticket granting ticket. This cert is encrypted and signed with the service account's password for the domain. The service account that does this is the KRB TGT account, and it's very important that we remember that for later. All right. So the only thing that can open and check this ticket is the domain controller itself, or any domain controller for that matter. Now, that's sent back to the user's workstation. When the user wants to access a service, let's say a SQL server, right? What happens is the user makes a request out to the domain controller saying, I want to access SQL Server A. The domain controller responds back with a ticket granting service ticket, a TGS. Okay? That ticket is encrypted with the password for the service account. So if there is a special SQL service account, we'll call it service account A, the password for service account A is what is used to encrypt that ticket. That ticket is sent to the user's workstation. The user then forwards that ticket over to the application server or the service that he wants to access. The service, because it's running as that service account, can then open the ticket and say, yes, you are allowed in, or no, you're not. This is all very secure, right? The user himself can't open any of the tickets. So how can we exploit this? Well, the first thing we can do is we can actually get service account passwords. Right? I had mentioned before that you can find services that are using Kerberos Authentication, right, by querying the domain for service principal names. Well, you can also use this to get the tickets and then using a utility, you can export them and then attempt to crack them offline. This is not really a flaw with Kerberos, right? The flaw with this is that administrators and people don't always assign very complex passwords to service accounts, right? So the process to do this, to get a service account password, which the colloquial name is Kerberosting, is first you get all the SPNs, and you want to only get SPNs for user accounts, right? So in this case, I'd use PowerShell, the second line there, and I'd only look for user accounts because computer account passwords are incredibly long and complex. You will never be able to crack them offline, right? So we're going to look for any user accounts that have a service principal name, service accounts, and get them. So we get all those SPNs, and then we reach out to the domain controller and say, I want to connect to each one of these services. Please send me a TGS. The domain controller does what it's supposed to, sends it to you. We then use utilities such as mimikatz to export those lists of certificates, and then we could take them offline and crack them through John the Ripper or a cracking server, something with a good amount of power. So let's grab some service accounts tickets. We're not going to attempt to crack them offline because that might take a little bit of time, but instead we're just going to go through the process of getting the certificates. So we're on our attack host, Cleo-Attack, and it's very simple. We're going to use PowerShell. And once again, so the first thing is you want to find your SPNs, your accounts that have SPNs. And you can do that by running getAdUser. It'll take just a little bit of time because I need to load it. And here are all the different ones. Now, if you want to go through and look at each one individually and grab a ticket for each one individually, you could run the command one by one. But I like to do it a little bit faster. So I modified my script here just a little bit that says get all the users and then immediately go forward and get a Kerberos token for each one of them. And so now you'll see it says, hey, it's grabbed these different ones and it's created in memory a key. So now we go to our favorite tool, as I said we would always, mimikatz. And all we're going to do is we are going to export them. And here you will see that it says it exported them. I ran Kerberos :list export. And if we actually go to the directory, if it loads, you'll see these are the files that you would take offline for different things, HTTP, LDAP, etc. You would take them, send them offline, and attempt to crack them. Instead of using the methods that I have under getTGS, your other option would be to use utilities such as invoke Kerberos, which is part of the PowerSploit and PowerShell Empire tools. Also, please remember that Kerberosting is not a failure of Kerberos itself. It is working as intended. What it's really a failure of is service account management. The reason this works is that administrators often do not assign very long and complex passwords to service accounts. They may not be short as the passwords users give their accounts, but they're still not very long. If an administrator uses a password length of 20 to 25 characters or longer with complexity, there is really no way that we're going to be able to crack it in any amount of time. But we still often see passwords that are 8 to 12 characters long, therefore making it very easy for a cracking server of any power to run through rainbow lists and word lists and create the proper hashes and find the passwords for these service accounts. The next attack that we're going to talk about that relies on Kerberos is the Kerberos pass the ticket attack. This is very similar to pass the hash in the fact that we don't actually know what the user account's password is, but what we do have is access to their TGT, and therefore we're going to use that to gain access to other systems and services. This, once again, is not a failure with Kerberos. This is a failure with account tiering, because in order to get access to another user's TGT, you must have admin access to a device that they are currently logged onto. Another important note is that the account that you want to use the TGT for cannot be a member of the protected users group. The protected users group is a security enhancement included with Windows Server 2012 R2. It offers numerous levels of protections to accounts that are members of it. Important ones include that the TGT only has a 4-hour lifetime, and that members of the group can't use NTLM authentication in any way, shape, or form. It offers many other protections, but we're not going to really go into that level of detail in this course. So let's take a look at the Kerberos Pass the Ticket attack. I have currently logged into Clio server with our user 1 account. If you remember, we made the user 1 account an administrator of Clio server back with the SMB Relay attack. User 1 does not have any domain admin privileges. The reason we logged into this server is that we found that Cleopatra is currently logged into it as well. This is great. Cleopatra is a domain admin. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our favorite tool, mimikatz. So let me get to the right directory. And it's very important that the PowerShell window that you open has administrative rights, or this will not work. So the first thing that we have to do is give mimikatz the ability to interact fully with the local security subsystem. That's done by doing privilege debug. Now, if this was an older server, let's say Windows Server 2008 R2, or even older than that, you could run login passwords, and it would actually give you the clear text password for the account. And if we go up here, we see here's Cleopatra, she's logged in. And down here under wdigest, you'd actually see the clear text password. By default, for Server 2012 R2 and newer, wdigest is turned off. You could turn it back on, but that wouldn't help in this session. So instead, because we don't have a clear text password, we want to get her ticket. Let me go back to the bottom and put the command in. And I'll put the command in. And what this is doing is that command, the tickets export command, is literally doing just what it sounds like. It's finding all of the different Kerberos tickets that are on this server right now and sending them out into a file. So now what we have to do is we have to find the one for Cleopatra. And here she is. And what you're doing is you're looking for the group 2 ticket. And here it is right now, down here. The group 2 ticket is a ticket granting ticket. So I grab this file name, and then I enter another command that's Kerberos PTT for pass a ticket, and then the file name. And what this does is it imports it into my session. So if we exit now, and we run kless to look at our Kerberos tickets, we'll see that we're actually Cleopatra at cleopatra.pvt. So let's see if I can open a remote PowerShell session now to our domain controller. And there I am. We now have full access, domain level access, because we were able to get their Kerberos ticket. And remember, just like Kerberosting, the pass the ticket is not really a failure of Kerberos. It's a failure of account management. We were only able to do this attack because we could get admin access to the same device that a domain administrator had logged into. If they were only logged into domain controllers, there is no way that we could also log into it as an administrator and get that level of access. So quickly, just to cover, the pass the ticket steps are here. You have to open PowerShell as administrator, run mimikatz as administrator, do the privilege debug. Always quickly check to see if the login passwords are there, right? To see if the clear text passwords are there, because maybe they turned wdigest on back on the server, even if it's not a default setting. If that doesn't work, then you run the tickets export, find the right ticket file name, import that into pass the ticket by using Kerberos pass the ticket, exit mimikatz, then run kless just to see that it's there, and then connect with that PowerShell session. The next thing that I want to talk about are isolated domain controllers. There have been many engagements I've gone to where clients have had a segmented and firewalled off environment for their CDE or card data or PII data, HIPAA data, whatever it might be. And in that firewalled location exists a domain controller as well. That way, all of the member servers and everything have something to use for authentication right there. They don't have to reach out through the firewall. Now, this is okay, except that everyone needs to understand that that domain controller is not really isolated, right? It might be isolated from normal user traffic, and it might be isolated from member server traffic from outside the CDE. However, it is not isolated from other domain controllers, right? Even if that domain controller is for a separate domain in the same forest, it still must be able to reach out and connect to other domain controllers in the forest and have other domain controllers reach in to talk to it, because all domain controllers initiate replication by pushing changes. Okay? Therefore, even if you can't find another pathway into that firewalled location, if you can compromise one domain controller in their environment, you can use it to pivot into the domain controller inside that firewalled location and then gain access to all the member servers in there. Now we're going to move from exploiting authentication protocols into how you exploit a trust. So before we start with that, let's actually cover what a trust is. A trust is a way of expanding the security boundary so that it's not just limited at the forest or domain level. It allows you to start interacting with remote resources. Now there's 4 different types of trusts. There's an IntraForest Trust, and those are trusts that happen between all domains within the same forest. They are transitive, which means that anybody in the forest can start leveraging the trust to access resources in any one of the domains in that forest. Then there's also interforest trust. These trusts happen between 2 different forests. Therefore, they can have separate schemas or be owned by separate entities, whatever it might be. These trusts are also transitive, which means that anybody in Forest A, regardless of what domain it is, has some level of access in Forest B, depending on the trust direction. Then there are domain-to-domain trusts, and there's 2 subtypes of this. First is an external trust, which is a domain trusts an external domain, a domain completely separate from itself, not within the same forest. This trust leverages NTLM for authentication and cannot use Kerberos. It has a couple other situations with it as well, but those are the main tidbits. Then there's also a shortcut trust, which is a domain-to-domain trust within the same forest. This allows some interesting behaviors to try and bypass how most Kerberos interactions work, but it still leverages Kerberos. Now, a trust has one of 2 directions. Sometimes they're called bidirectional trusts, but really that means that the trust is it has both an outgoing and an incoming component. The direction of the trust determines the level of access. So when you say you have an outgoing trust, in this case, our domain on the left trusts domain B, that means that resources, it is currently trusting the other domain. So items in this domain, users in this domain, can access resources in this other domain. The incoming trust means that this domain is trusted by this domain. It's very confusing to say trusted, trusting, and outgoing and incoming. The important part is, if it is an incoming trust, it means that you can use accounts in that environment to access resources on the other side of the trust. Outgoing means just the opposite. One important thing to know is that a trust is just that. As soon as you establish a trust relationship with another forest, all of the domains in those forests, or domains to domains, are all included as authenticated users. This immediately gives them some level of access to resources in your environment. That could just be, I can see and read information out of Active Directory, or it could be, I have access to file shares in your environment, right? So it's very important to understand, once you trust something else, you have an outgoing trust, or you are trusting another domain, that domain has some level of access into your domain and resources in your domain. Trusts originally had a serious security issue that would allow an attacker in the trusted domain to grant themselves any level of access to resources in the trusting domain. Therefore, Microsoft made some changes around Windows Server 2000 SP3 and added something called SID filtering or SID quarantining, so that when you access remote resources through an external trust, not a trust within your same forest, but an external trust, it would remove any additional SIDs or identifiers other than your core one for your user account. It means you had to be explicitly granted access to groups or resources in the trusting domain, and you couldn't add additional things and carry it across the trust relationship. Now, there still are times where you'll find that the trusts still have the lower security, and that could be for a variety of reasons. It could either be A, the trusts were created prior to Windows 2000 SP3, and they have never been recreated since then, therefore the new permission model isn't in place, or the security has been relaxed for some reason. All right, and that could be because they're in the middle of a migration, or there is some reason that they need to be able to pass more than one SID through the trust. And the way that you can go through this is first by identifying the trust, right? Now, I gave a quick PowerShell method to do that, and it gives you all the important information to make the determination if you can exploit the trust or not. So in the list here, we have 3 different trusts, and this is from our main domain that we want to gain access to, Caesar.pvt. So the first one is Caesar Trust Cleopatra, right? And it is not within the forest. It's not an IntraForest Trust, okay? And it is forest transitive, which means that it is a forest-to-forest trust. And in this case, we want to look for this flag here that says SID filtering is forest aware, and that quarantining is false. This means that you can pass additional SIDs through SID history and have them be recognized by systems in the other domain. Next up is Julia. Julia is a child, right? She is part of the same forest, IntraForest Trust. Therefore, it has a whole set of permissions and things that work in a specific way. Next up is Casca.pvt. Casca here is an external trust, domain to domain. It is not IntraForest, it is not forest transitive, but SID filtering quarantining has been turned off. If it was a normal external trust, this would be true. If this was a normal IntraForest Trust, this would be false as well. You can also get the same bit of information by using NLTest domain trust, which we had talked about in the beginning, and then you can actually get more information about each trust by running the different netdom trust command. Now, there's something new that Microsoft is talking about forcing come July this year that would not allow TGT delegation to happen between trusts. They have not enabled this, and I'm waiting to see what happens, but it could change what we're about to talk about. First, we're going to talk about how you can exploit intra-forest trusts. As I've mentioned many times over, domains within a forest are not a security boundary, right? You have some level of access within your forest. That means because they're not security boundaries and you have this access, if you can compromise any domain in a forest, you compromise all the domains in the forest, okay? You need to have several pieces of information to actually run this attack. You need to have the KRV TGT hash for the compromised domain, the one that you have already. You need the SID for that domain. You need the name of an account on the other side that has the access you want. You need the name of the forest root. You need the SID of the domain controllers group for the forest root, and the SID for the enterprise domain controllers group, which is always S-1-5-9. And then you run a command. And what this will do is it will give you a golden ticket for the root domain that has access everywhere. So what we're going to do now is we are going to give ourselves full access into the Caesar.pvt domain from its child, Julia.Caesar.pvt. So in this case, we're going to say that we have fully exploited the Julia domain. We're currently logged into a domain controller, even though we don't need to do that, as administrator in this case. And once again, it really just has to be any domain admin ID. And what we're going to do is we're first going to start leveraging that trust to get a little bit of information about the Caesar.pvt domain. We need to know what the domain SID is. And there it is right there. Next, we have to get the SID of the domain controllers group. Now you have two options. You can go the slightly longer method, which is what I'm going to try really fast. And what this does is it once again queries the domain across a trust. And that gives you the SID right here. Now, if you notice, it is just the domain SID and -516 on the end. It will always be the domain SID and -516. Next up, we get to use our favorite tool, mimikatz. And as you see, I am in an administrative window. As always, we need to let it fully interact with the security subsystem, privilege debug. And what I want to do now, because I'm an administrator, I can look at this information. I need to get all the information about the Julia KRB TGT account. Remember, this is the account that encrypts all of the tickets generated by the Julia domain. And right here is the hash that we need. This is what it actually uses to encrypt everything. All right. So we also get other information that we need for this. We get the domain SID, which is there, the first beginning part. We also get the hash, as I mentioned. So now what we need to do is we create a golden ticket. The golden ticket is a special version of a TGT ticket that is generated without actually having the login right? The ability to log in with the password. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass a variety of pieces of information. And because it's long, I have it written down somewhere else. But you're going to tell it you want to create a golden ticket. You're going to create a ticket in the Julia domain for our account administrator. Here is the SID of the compromised domain, Julia. Here is the hash of the KRB TGT account for Julia. And here's the extra SIDs that I want to add on top of it to get access to. And here is the domain controllers group for Caesar.pvt, and here's the enterprise domain controller group. And then I'm going to say pass the ticket so I can instantly use it. And it says, hey, all right, we created a golden ticket for administrator. Great. And it's in our current session. What this means is now I want to get the KRB TGT information for the Caesar domain. And as we run it, we can see now I have the hash for this domain for Caesar. At this point, I could create myself another golden ticket and get myself any level of access to any of the domains following the same pattern. As we've seen, it's remarkably easy to gain complete control over the entire forest once you compromise one domain in that forest. And that's because, once again, the forest is the security boundary. Now, it is possible to exploit other trusts to external resources, but it works just a little bit differently. This is due to the SID filtering, which is enabled on every trust to an external entity. To understand how SID filtering works, which we're going to dig into a little bit more, you have to understand how Windows security works in general. When a user logs in, they have a token that is created that is comprised of all of the security IDs or SIDs associated with that user. That includes the user account SID itself, plus all the SIDs of all the groups the user account is a member of. It also includes any SIDs that are added to a special attribute called SID history. Now, when SID filtering is in place, what happens is when that token is passed across the trust, all of the additional SIDs, all the group SIDs, all the SIDs in SID history are pretty much negated and removed from that user account's token, and all they get to pass is their true user account security ID. If SID filtering is disabled on the trust, you can start passing those extra security IDs associated with the user account across the trust. However, it's not really fully disabled. It's only relaxed. And that means any SID for well-known groups, which are pretty much the SIDs under 1,000, won't be accepted no matter what you do. So you can't automatically add yourself to the domain admins group or the enterprise admins group or domain controllers like we did before. You have to find a different group, like maybe a server admin group or some other group that you've discovered that grants administrative access to other devices. And then you continue the pivoting process on devices in that remote domain until you eventually find the domain admin or administrative account to the domain. This is accomplished by adding SIDs pertaining to groups in that remote domain to the SID history attribute to the user account in your compromised domain. Now, this is the same for IntraForest and external trusts. Even though IntraForest Trust can use Kerberos tickets for authentication, the method we used with the IntraForest Trust before won't work, where you just added that extra little bit of information to your request for a Kerberos ticket. In theory, it should, but it has yet to ever really work that way, and I found SID history to be a much more reliable method. So let's now exploit the trust between two external resources. In this case, I'm going to be leveraging the trust between Caesar and Cleo-Attack. That's an IntraForest trust. The steps we would take would be the exact same if we were exploiting an external trust between two different domains as well. So when I was doing my discovery of the Cleo-Attack domain and forest, I did a quick check to see what trusts it had. And when I did that, I noticed that Cleo-Attack trusts Caesar, and it is a forest-to-forest trust. Great. You'll notice this side of the trust does not have any SID filtering, which means we couldn't add entries to a user account in Caesar and have them be leveraged over here in Cleo-Attack. However, when we look at the other side of the trust from the Caesar's point of view, not Cleo-Attack's point of view, we look and we say, hey, here's the trust. It is a forest-to-forest trust, and SID filtering is forest aware. That means that any entries in the SID history attribute of a user account in the Cleo-Attack domain will be sent across the trust and used when someone tries to access a resource on a system in Caesar. Also, when I was doing my discovery, I found that Caesar has this group called server admins. Maybe I ran this through Bloodhound and I saw that domain admins of the Caesar domain are currently sitting on servers that we could get to if we granted ourselves this access, or maybe I just found the group and I thought, let's see what I can get to in that domain. Now we're going to actually assign this to our user 1 account. So let me quickly try and map a drive over to the web server sitting in Caesar. And just to show you right now, this account cannot get there. Access is denied. Well, that's no good. So we need to go about adding this SID for server admins to the SID history attribute of our user 1 account. To do that, we're going to use mimikatz, as we have for all of the other processes so far. But in order to have mimikatz push this information, we need to do a couple of steps. We need to load the Mimi driver service, and you do that by putting bang and the plus symbol. And then we need to tell mimikatz that we want it to look for other instances of PowerShell and mimikatz and do something at certain times. The reason we have to do these preparatory steps is because we're going to use a function of mimikatz called DCShadow. DCShadow allows mimikatz to pretend it's a domain controller and push changes out to another domain controller and have them be processed as if, once again, mimikatz was a domain controller itself. The reason we want to use DCShadow is because it ignores all of the auditing that they might have on a domain controller. When you make changes in Active Directory, the domain controller that processed that change is the one who creates the audit flag. So if we added groups to a user, or we deleted a user, or we did anything like that, the domain controller that actually made the change is the one that creates the audit entry. Since mimikatz is actually going to be doing the change and pushing the changes out to a domain controller, there is no auditing. And this is very important because anytime you leverage SID history, it will automatically create a higher severity auditing event. And most organizations are probably looking for that because they know that if you use SID history, there's a possibility that you're trying to exploit the trusts. So what we have done is we have this version of mimikatz ready. It is sitting there ready to start using DCShadow. I'm going to pass the command to say run DCShadow. And what we're going to do is you have to tell it what object you want to do, the attribute you want to modify, and the value you want to put in there. Relatively simple. And this is the SID that we got before. You wait, you see it tells you, all right, I have set myself up. I'm ready to make this change. I'm now pretending to be a domain controller. You run another instance of mimikatz. And at this point, you say LSA dump, DCShadow, and push. And once you do that, mimikatz reaches out to a known domain controller. It makes the change. It replicates the change. It doesn't really make the change. It replicates the change to the domain controller. So now, if we go over and we look at our user account in Attribute Editor, and we look at SID history, you'll see that we now have that entry. This is good. We should now be able to map that drive as user 1. And now I have admin access to the web.caesar.pvt. It's important to know that you have to use a third-party tool like mimikatz to make changes to the SID history attribute. Even if you have domain admin access or enterprise admin access, whatever you have to your compromised forest, you can't modify the SID history attribute by default. It is protected, and Active Directory won't even let you make a change using Active Directory users and computers or PowerShell, whatever it might be. It takes a special type of program to do it, whether that's mimikatz or maybe you wanted to use something like the AD migration tool, any number of things, special programs, but you can't do it by default with inherent Windows tools. The other thing I want to point out is that there are other options with mimikatz you could use to populate the SID history attribute, such as making the change directly in Active Directory. But that, as I said before, is not the best way to do it because the domain controller that processed the change would flag that auditing event and most likely send an alert to the SOC or the company as you're making the changes. Therefore, DCShadow is your best option. There's one last thing I'd like to say about trusts, and that I have seen trusts be set up between two different entities so that they can share information, but they are supported by different groups. If you see this situation and you see that the trusts are insecure, right, the security has been relaxed from your client's side, you need to point out the risk that they have exposed their group to, right? They are trusting a third-party resource, and if they allow SIDs to pass across that trust, they have no control over what that other group could be doing in their environment. So, if this were a pen test, we would now have complete control over our client's Windows environment. We leveraged numerous vulnerabilities they had, such as lack of account tiering, very common, clear text IDs and passwords, not quite as common, and trust to own the entire forest. We would typically stop now or say we could get to your data or continue leveraging our access to find that proprietary data that our client wanted us to find in the first place. The other thing we could do is start working with our client to see what detection methods they have for persistent access. While persistent access is typically done on individual servers, it can also be done with Active Directory. And these are some of the methods you could use to make sure you retain your full admin access and test your client's detection properties. The first one in the list is storing a golden ticket offline. Yes, we used a golden ticket when we were exploiting the trust within a forest. However, that was only within that session, right? Once we closed that PowerShell window, that golden ticket expired. It no longer could be used. It wouldn't exist anymore. Storing it offline poses a small security threat, right? If anybody found that ticket file, they could then leverage it and have admin access, right? There are no controls. At least with our session, it was somehow tied to our existing logon session on that device. So definitely talk to the client before you export a golden ticket. Make sure that's something that they want to see if they can find before you do it. The next item on the list, we can go and we can modify the ACLs on OUs or on the domain, right? Go up to that top level of the domain and grant ourselves full read-write access to all objects in the domain. Grant that to our user account. At that point, you can make any changes you want except to domain admin and the admin account entries, things like domain admins, enterprise admins, etc. We could also grant ourselves the replicate directory changes, right? Both of these would not be seen as group memberships. Our client would actually have to be auditing ACLs in Active Directory to see these changes happen or see that we now have access. The next thing you could do is grant yourself some different rights through admin SD holder. Admin SD holder is an object that sits in Active Directory and it has a certain set of security ACLs to it. Those ACLs are periodically forced upon all of those special admin groups in AD and admin users in AD, such as members of domain admins, member of enterprise admins, etc. Everybody who has that admin count equals 1 in their admin count equals 1 attribute. If you go and you modify the ACLs assigned to admin SD holder, the next time it runs, it would then make those changes in all of those special IDs and groups. Similar to changing the ACLs at the top level of the domain, we could change it here and watch it replicate and grant our regular user account the ability to modify those groups or those objects. And once again, unless our client is actually actively watching for changes to admin SD holder, they would not see this go through. The last one on the list here, change primary group, is probably one of my favorites because I typically don't see people monitoring and looking for changes to the attribute you would use here. The primary group is a holdover from some legacy Unix to Active Directory functionality, right? And you can go in and you can modify this attribute to be any group you want. Typically, it's domain users. But if we wanted, we can make this something like enterprise admin or domain admin, and you would have that level of access, even though your ID would not appear in those groups. So let's go ahead and grant our generic user account persistent domain admin access to the Cleo-Attack domain. We're going to do this by changing its primary group membership. We're also going to see why this attack is so useful and why it's not detected by most automated systems. So first off, we'll look at our generic user. I'm on the Cleo-Attack domain controller, Clio DC. Here is generic user, user 1, and right now he is a member of domain users and his primary group is domain users. We're going to go over to our member server where I have mimikatz ready to run DCShadow again, and we're using DCShadow so that we don't generate any auditing when this change is made. So I already have it set up. I loaded the driver and it's looking for the proper information. This time when I tell it to do DCShadow, I'm telling that I want it to change the primary group ID to be 512. We're not changing the SID history attribute in this case, but primary group ID. And I chose the number 512 because that will always be the number for domain admins regardless of what domain it is. It's considered a well-known SID, so 512 for domain admins. Set DCShadow up. It's sitting there running in the background. And I tell DCShadow, hey, let's push those changes. It's done so. Things are different. So if we look at our user now, and we look at it in Active Directory users and computers, we'll notice that, hey, the information has changed to be domain admins, and its primary group ID is domain admins. That's troubling, agreed. However, most people aren't looking at accounts through Active Directory users and computers. Instead, they're using some automated tool, that goes out and checks the membership of the domain admins group or looks for people to become members of domain admins, whatever it might be. So if we actually look at the properties of our user account, we'll see that he is not a member of any group, which is accurate because the only reason he has that membership in ADUC is it looked at the primary group ID of 512 and, found what that group was and listed it as the group, as being a member of that group, but it's not really there. If we look at domain admins, which I'd done beforehand as well, we'll notice that our user account is not in there. He is not officially a member of the domain admins group, but his primary group ID has changed. So if someone is actually looking for that attribute, primary group ID, then they will see that it's there. Otherwise, they will not know it. And because he is unofficially a member of the domain admins group, he has all the rights and privileges of a domain admin, even though he's not officially a member of that group. And while the user ID will not ever appear in the domain admins group, eventually SD admin holder will come around and change the security on that generic user account and flag it as an admin count, changing the admin count equals to 1. So that could show up if somebody starts searching for those types of IDs, but they wouldn't know necessarily why or how it happened. It's still a minor detection compared to other things such as looking at the membership of the domain admins group or membership of user accounts. Just as a quick review of what we did with DCShadow to change the primary group ID, as well as just to show the command method to use DCShadow, here it is. You have to open a PowerShell window as administrator, run mimikatz, use the system driver, have it look for other mimikatz instances so it knows when to start the push, and then you run LSA dump DCShadow. You tell the object that you want to modify, and then the attribute you want to modify, and the new value. Open a second window, mimikatz window, run LSA dump DCShadow push. That concludes all the different topics for our course today. Over the last 2 hours, we covered numerous different topics pertaining to Active Directory, not only learning a little bit about what it is, its attack surface, ways that you can find the domain when you land on a network, ways that you can search for different targets within Active Directory and find perhaps the path to get to those targets, different ways of getting passwords and password hashes, ways that you can use the inherent security protocols to gain elevated access with an Active Directory, methods of leveraging trusts to change where you have admin access, and then finally some different methods that you could use to grant yourself persistent access if you wanted. Some quick final thoughts. Really, the biggest one is that Active Directory itself is remarkably secure. There's very little within it that you can use to grant yourself elevated access. It's improper configurations that cause the largest number of issues, and the biggest one by far is account tiering, right? The lack of account tiering in environments. This is what allows attackers and pen testers to pivot from a normal user account to perhaps workstation admins or server admins or just domain admins, whatever it might be, with just a couple hops within the environments. If IDs were properly tiered and segmented, that ability to pivot and escalate privileges would not really be available to them. Another quick note, when you're looking at trust, be sure to look at both sides of the trust. Look at it from both the trusting side and the trusted side. Sometimes the information is slightly different as far as, if the security is weaker or not. So be sure to look at both sides of a trust when you are looking for them. And that concludes the Red Teaming Adventures in Active Directory course. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me. My email address is there at the bottom, eric@securideas.com. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful day.